I am the head of the Urban Investment Group at Goldman Sachs, which is an investment platform that has invested over $19 billion in economic development projects since 2001. In addition to that, I also have the great privilege serving as a board member for the Center for Urban Future. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Even, in the breakfast session, I heard so many great ideas of what people were talking about and some of the challenges that New York City is facing. And so I think this forum today is going to be a great way to listen to some amazing leaders and visionaries to address that problem. I also want to say a huge thank you to the Fisher brothers and Winston Fisher for making today's event possible. In case you're not familiar with us, the Center for Urban Future is an independent think tank that advocates concrete ideas for building a stronger and more inclusive economy, especially in New York. And it also does work that expands economic opportunity for all New Yorkers. The work that Jonathan Bowles and his team do translate into real-world results. Just in the last few months, our work has spurred a private foundation to fund new startup competition explicitly for entrepreneurs living in NYC across the city. It's also inspired City Council Speaker Adrian Adams to create CUNY Reconnect, which is a first-of-its-kind returnship program to re-enroll working adults at CUNY. It's also contributed to a new city investment to expand dedicated centers for teenagers at New York City public libraries. And finally, it's influenced a major city expansion of youth apprenticeship programs. I'm incredibly proud that CUF's work routinely sparks new policies that expand pathways to the middle class in New York. CUF has a lot more reports on the way that will help lay the groundwork for a more equitable economy in New York. But we also know that making progress in this area will be a lot more difficult if we don't continue to grow the city's overall economy and expand the number of good jobs in the city. I've had the privilege of living in New York City for 2 decades, and during that time, economic growth has been a real given for that time and even the decade preceding that. But today, the city faces new economic challenges and new competitive threats, and those don't seem to be going away anytime soon. I think all of us in this room today believe that New York has the ability to overcome these challenges, and it has the potential to be a huge winner in the post-pandemic landscape. Getting there will require new policies, new initiatives, and it will mean doing some things really differently. And I think it will also mean having the political will as a city to make real changes in how we've been doing things and as a state. I'm so excited for the panelists that we have today who will share some solutions that we need the most, and who also, very importantly, have the experience and the visionary leadership to understand what can be done and how we can accomplish that. Thank you to our amazing speakers today, and again, a huge thank you to the Fisher brothers and Winston Fisher for sponsoring this forum, for supporting CUF's forthcoming reports with ideas for keeping New York competitive, and for being just an amazing partner to CUF on our middle-class jobs project for the past several years. And now I'd like to turn things over to CUF Executive Director Jonathan Bowles.
All right, thanks, Sherry. Good morning. How's everybody doing? I am really excited about today's forum, and not just because we have amazing speakers. And by the way, have you seen our lineup? We have amazing speakers, so thanks to all of them for being here today. And thanks to everybody that's here, and thanks to the 100 or 150 or so people that are tuning in online. We have a great set of discussions for you. And don't forget, we have a really amazing first panel, but then we have a second one that features the 2 economic development leaders for the city and the state. So stay tuned for that. I think what I'm most excited about today, though, is that this is a discussion about ideas. Really tangible, concrete solutions that our leaders in New York can take to keep New York competitive amidst a significantly changed economic landscape. First, I want to say that there's a lot that's going right with New York right now. I'm especially encouraged with what might be the most diverse economy that we've ever had in this city. The fact that there are so many areas of strength in the city's economy, I think, is a big reason that we've just surpassed the level of employment that we had before the pandemic. It took a couple of years to get there, but now that we're here, I think the fact that we have so many pillars of strength is really what sets us apart, and it creates such a strong foundation for this city to move forward. But while I'm optimistic about New York, I'm also worried about some of the economic challenges that New York is contending with today, many of which really hit at the heart of what keeps New York strong. As one example, New York's single biggest competitive advantage in recent years has been its ability to attract and retain highly educated people. But remote and hybrid work makes workers more mobile than ever, and clearly some are leaving. New York City's population has shrunk by 468,000 since 2020, and about 55% of the movers in the first 2 years of the pandemic had a bachelor's or advanced degree, compared to 15% of the movers in the 3 years prior to the pandemic. That's according to a recent analysis by Citizens Budget Commission and John Mollenkoff. Remote work and the impact of e-commerce on storefront retail are also creating new challenges for our business districts and commercial corridors, and new concerns for the city's finances. A few weeks back, I had a chance to interview Jamie Dimon at a conference about apprenticeships. I asked him what he thought about New York's prospects. He said New York is facing new competitive threats for highly educated workers from cities that are a lot more attractive than they were a decade ago. And he said that New York is going to have to fight more than it has in recent years to hold on to its talent advantages. If he's right, if New York does have to fight, what does that look like? What are some of the specific things that city and state leaders should do to address these new and emerging and advancing challenges? The new New York panel that came out this past December is clearly a good start. But what other creative ideas are needed? That's really what our forum today is all about. I'm excited to hear what our panelists think should be done. Once again, a big thank you to Winston Fisher Brothers, for making today possible. I also want to have a big thank you to our staff at the Center for an Urban Future for putting on such great events. And now let's bring up the panel. And I'm going to turn it over to CUF's Policy Director, Eli Dvorkin. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. There's a lot of energy out there in the lobby, but I'm not hearing it right now. Let's try one more time. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Okay, that sounds better. I want to bring some of that lobby energy up on stage with us right now, so let's see if we can do it. My name is Eli Dvorkin. It's my pleasure to moderate today's discussion. Let me briefly introduce our amazing panelists, and then we'll get right into it. Starting to my right is Winston Fisher. Winston is a partner at Fisher Brothers, the real estate firm here in the city, and CEO of Area 15, an experiential retail and entertainment company with a major location in Vegas and more to come. Winston also serves as commissioner of the Port Authority and has really spearheaded the Middle Class Jobs Project with us at the Center for an Urban Future for many years now. Great to see you, Winston. Thanks for being here. Thank you. To his right is Larissa Ortiz. Larissa is managing director at Street Sense, where she leads economic development consulting for municipal and nonprofit clients. She has leveraged her expertise in retail real estate to spearhead multiple COVID-19 recovery efforts across the city, and we're really thrilled to have you here today, Larissa. Thanks for joining us. To her right is Seth Pinsky. You guys got into alphabetical order, actually. Seth is CEO of 92nd Street Y, New York, which he steered through the pandemic and is now leading into the future with a new action plan for the institution's 150th anniversary. Previously, Seth was executive vice president at RXR Realty and was president of the New York City Economic Development Corporation. Good to have you, Seth. To his right is Julie Samuels. Julie is the founder and executive director and president, I believe, of Tech NYC, the organization representing the city's diverse and fast-growing tech sector. Julie's also a venture partner at Hanger, and she previously led Engine, a national nonprofit focused on technology entrepreneurship. Hey, Julie. To Julie's right is Jessica Walker. Jessica is the CEO and president of the Manhattan Chamber of Commerce, which supports more than 120,000 businesses across the island of Manhattan. Jessica previously served in leadership roles at the Partnership for New York City, at the New York Academy of Medicine, and is a real lifetime policy wonk, so it's great to have you on the stage. Great to have you join us today, Jessica. Thanks. And last but certainly not least, to our far right is Eric Gertler. Eric is the executive chairman and CEO of U.S. News and World Report, and previously led Empire State Development during the COVID-19 pandemic. He also previously served as executive vice president of NYC EDC and as managing director for the Center for Economic Transformation. Hey, Eric, great to have you with us. We were close. So, as Jonathan mentioned up front, I mean, we're seeing some good news in New York City today. We've got, over 4.1 million private sector jobs back, more than we even had in 2019, led by some of the sectors represented right here on the stage, I will say, like the tech sector, which is up, I think, almost 9% since 2019. But we also have some real challenges. So I wanted to start with a kind of a blue sky question addressing some of those challenges that Jonathan laid out, attracting and retaining talent, and as he mentioned, what that agenda to fight for New York City, to fight for workers, for talent, for entrepreneurs really should look like. What are the, not just the stakes of that fight, what are the specific things we should be doing? So I want to ask you all, as we think about this big topic, keeping New York City competitive in an age of hybrid work, in a new reality that's not just here in New York, but across the world, what are some of the key things? What's one thing that the city you think should really focus on to sharpen its competitive edge? And I'll turn this one over to anybody who wants to kick us off.
I can start, because we'll talk a little bit about tech, I think. Tech is largely responsible for much of that job growth. And while the numbers have come a little bit back down to earth during COVID, it was tech that kind of got us through economically speaking. And I would just say, and I'm going to answer your question, but I have to say one quick thing that I think is so important to ground this conversation, and it's that I used to live in San Francisco. I used to live in the Valley. And if you had told me that a bunch of tech companies would leave San Francisco, I would have told you were out of your mind. But then 2021 happened, and all the tech companies left San Francisco. And so I think as we have this conversation, it's really important, from a tech perspective at least, to understand that tech companies are mobile. They will leave, but I don't think they have any plans to leave New York. But I guess my point is that if things went sideways, they would. And so to answer your question more directly, and I know I'm pretty sure everyone's going to agree with some version of this, but for tech specifically, the companies will go where the people they want to hire are. And so that means that the issues most important to keep New York competitive are issues around livability, that the employees want to be here, they feel like they can afford to be here, they feel like they can raise a family here, they feel safe, they feel like there's things they want to do. And if people, young professional people want to live here, then everything else kind of falls into place. So we can dig in on what some of those actual things are, but I think that's how I see the setup as it applies to tech and beyond.
Yes,
I just want to build on that, and I agree completely. And when I was at EDC, what I used to say about talent was that talent was to New York as oil is to Saudi Arabia. It's the basis of our entire economy. And if you think about the virtuous cycle that we had going for 20 plus years in New York, what happened was we were able to attract talent. The talent attracted businesses, businesses attracted more talent, and so on and so on. And I agree completely with what Julie said about livability, but I also think it's important to remember that that's only half of the equation. Everybody who lives in New York at some point or another, probably every day, does a little calculation in their head where they think about all the things that are so difficult about living in New York. They think about crime, they think about dirt, they think about expense, everything else. And then they balance that against all the things that are great about living in New York. And one of the challenges I think that we have coming out of the pandemic is that on the livability side of the equation, many things have gotten worse since the pandemic. And in addition to that, on the plus side of the equation, one of the things that brought a lot of people to the city was the fact that if they wanted their careers to advance, they had to be here in New York. And I still think that's largely the case, but it's less the case now than it was before. So that's less of an advantage than we had before. And on top of that, all the other things that are great about living in New York, whether it's great restaurants, cultural institutions, entertainment venues, there are fewer of those now. So we're dealing with a city where the pluses are lower, the minuses are higher. And I think if we want to try to continue to attract the talent that's driving our economy, we have to make sure that we're focused on both sides of that equation.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of you. And it's true. And so I think what Jonathan, you said in the beginning is right. We have to fight. And that's just what it is. At the very heart of it, they do the calculation. Is this a place that we want to be? And the answer is still yes. New York is a great place, but it's not great enough. And the competition is real. People are moving to Austin. They are moving to Nashville. They are moving to Miami. tax reasons, affordability of housing. And I think that is an issue that anybody who spoke to me this morning knows how I'm pretty animated, that we've talked about it ad nauseum and we don't solve it. And we've got to accept that we're not solving it and actually just solve the problem. We don't need to hear another idea. We know the ideas. We've got to get through that because that's existential to New York. We can't do anything. We can't play offense if we don't have affordable housing at all levels. Crime, infrastructure, your power grid, all of these things are critical. And then I guess the plug is the arts. You know, art and culture is going to be, you know, that what keeps people here. Is going to keep, you know, the restaurants, the nightlife, public art. Those are the things that excite people's soul. And we've got to do a better job. And so I think these are things that, as a city, do we have the processes in place to fight today? Because it's not the ideas we're missing. It's, to me, the process to fight. And I think we have to, and I feel no, we don't. So that's where I would love to see the city and state move towards, is changing process to be more nimble and competitive.
No, I'll add, you know, as we think about the implications of hybrid work, I do believe there is sort of an existential crisis here. You know, if we look at the impact of hybrid work, Nick Bloom did some research that, you know, he came to the conclusion that, you know, we've lost over $12 billion of spending from people who used to come every single day. And we ran some calculations. That's the equivalent of about 500 blocks of retail. And when you know, end up in a place where you have vacancies on the ground floor, where it doesn't feel quite right, I mean, you start thinking about, is this the kind of place I want to be? I came to New York because I want to live in a place that's vibrant, where I, you know, can run out and grab my pizza and my bagel, you know, around the corner, and it's open 24 hours. You know, these are the things that we have to think about. And, you know, one of the conclusions sort of we've come to in terms of getting to something tangible, when we think about the need to support and create a value proposition for what is going to have to come, which is the office to residential conversions that we're increasingly talking about as office buildings become, you know, ripe for that, is creating neighborhoods again, is investing in the social infrastructure. And we built, Midtown was never meant to be a neighborhood. So how can we assume that people are going to want to live there, you know, when they have other options, of course, and it comes down to choice. So, you know, thinking about what it's really going to take to, you know, make the ground floor experience wonderful, create the playgrounds and the, you know, the dog parks and the places that create real neighborhoods, that get people out of their homes and buying coffee, you know, on their way to the park. So, you know, those are the kinds of investments I think we have to be thinking about if we want to sort of fight for what is Midtown, because Midtown is our front door. You know, it's the first thing you think about. Is New York healthy? You know, our neighborhoods, I think, generally are doing very well, but I do think we have to think about Midtown, particularly its linkage to hybrid work.
I just want to say one thing about Midtown, because I have office buildings there, and so it is a real crisis. And it's not that people aren't returning to work, but they're not coming back. And so a simple number is New York City had roughly, the commercial space had a structural vacancy of around 10%, right? Depends on where the market was. So 400 million square feet, 40 million square feet at any one time was vacant, but it gets absorbed. Today, that structural vacancy is 20 to 25%. So just mathematically, that means there's another 40 to 50 million square feet of space that just won't get absorbed. So it's the scale of what we're talking about is huge. It's not just convert an old office building to residential. That has so many challenges. It can be done, but not easy. It's deeper than that. We need comprehensive programs of public-private ideas, and each one is going to be a little bit nuanced or different. And so we need a process that allows for that, because we are talking about 40 to 50 million square feet of office space that I don't think has much economic value today. That has a serious consequence.
That's why I wanted to expand the conversation a little bit. We've been focusing really on making New York City a better place to live and a better place to work. But I think that we all know that hybrid work is going to remain with us for the foreseeable future. And so the other component I think we have to really think about is our visitors, our tourists.
Yes.
Making sure that this city is a place where people want to come and have fun. You talked about art, and I think there's a lot of things that we could be doing to sort of build upon that. So I'm happy to talk about that as well. But it's just, I just want to say from the small business perspective, in Midtown and other areas, it was really important for tourists to be the ones making up the foot traffic where there were not, workers in those office buildings. So it really is an important component for the discussion.
Can I say one quick thing, Eric? I know you have to talk, but just to build on the tourism thing really quickly. This is a kind of a more politically charged, but we basically just shut down Airbnb in New York. And hotels are outrageously expensive right now. They're the most expensive they've been, I think, ever. I'm going to get the number wrong, but the average hotel in New York City right now is well over $600-700 a night. And I think we really should be readdressing how we came to that political outcome.
Housing is unaffordable. That's why we came to it. Sorry. Didn't want to interrupt, but that's why we came to that.
So I'll jump in. It seems that this is the classic case where everything has been said, just not everybody has said it. So I'm going to repeat a few of the things that everybody has said. But I remember going back on my personal experience, October 2001, and I was born in Canada. I went down to the courthouse in October 2001 to be naturalized as a U.S. citizen. And I remember going down to the courthouse under armed guards because it was a very scary time. And we had just gone through 9/11 a month earlier. And I remember thinking that could there be a worse time to be in this city at that time? And, everything, in the financial district had really been decimated. People had left. And I looked around the room, and I kept on thinking, why did all these people want to become American citizens, and why did they want to live in New York City? And the reality is, as we all know, just to provide some context, is we have weathered so many different transformations and crises over the history of New York. And we've gone from a trading post to a port city to a service town, finance, tech. We've done all this, and in the last 50 years, we've overcome, the 1970s when Fortune 500 companies were leaving, 7,000 people were leaving every month, 9/11, 2009, and now we're faced with COVID. And when I think about that, I look at, again, it's what everybody said on this panel. It's not just the talent, but it's the immigrants that want to come, not just from other countries, because this city is made up of, if you look at it, 85% of the city is made up of people who are immigrants, children of immigrants who have come from other places. And that magnet that draws people to this, based on everything that people said, continues to be the essence of the city. But we need to think about these problems much more quickly than we have in the past. And so, I used to cite an example that if you think about Detroit in the 70s was sort of the booming town, and New York was going backward. In one generation that flipped. Detroit was going down, New York was booming. We cannot take it, for granted. But it's really, and yes, we need all the quality of life issues, and we need to make sure that this city remains an inclusive place where people want to be, where people are respected. But maybe because my first public service job was working for Seth, the other quote that we used to say was, talent doesn't need to chase money, money chases talent. And if we have the right people here, then I think that we can weather, the storm. But we need to do it quickly. I think in a world of technology, in a world where people are mobile, where people have choices, we don't have the same luxury of waiting.
I was just going to say, I know that because this is a Center for Urban Future gathering, that we're eventually going to get to solutions, not just talking about the problems. But I do want to also add just one other layer to the challenge that we're facing with remote work and the diminished connection between businesses and workers and New York City. And it's one that I think a lot of people don't think about, but it feeds into this cyclicality issue that New York faces, which in the past has been a benefit. We've benefited from these virtuous cycles, but we've also seen in the 70s how those cycles can reverse and then feed off themselves in the other direction. And the other thing I just want to point out, which maybe won't sound as important as some of the other things, but I think that it all does feed into the reason why we should be concerned about this, is that the connection that businesses have to New York, the connection that workers have to New York, goes deeper than just coming into the office, doing their job, paying taxes, and leaving. They shop at the retail in the area. They consume services. But they do more than even that. They're the people who are attending Broadway shows. They're the people who are taking advantage of our nightlife. They're also the people who are philanthropists. I'll just give you an example. On our board during the pandemic, I think 20% of our board left New York permanently. And those are people who have been dedicated, lifelong New Yorkers who are very involved not just with the 92nd Street Y, but with lots of other arts and cultural institutions. And by the way, think about our civic infrastructure. In the 1970s, in addition to everything that government did, the Lou Rudins of the world, the Felix Rotens of the world, if businesses are less connected to New York, the chances of having civic leaders like that are diminished as well. And so I think these are all reasons why we have to take this change very seriously. And as everyone else has said, it doesn't mean that it's impossible to solve this, but we can't just dismiss it. We can't just say, oh, this is the new reality, we'll live with it, because it's going to represent a fundamental change in the way the city works.
So, I mean, let me ask you a little bit more about, you read my mind. I absolutely want to start to push on some of the solutions, some of the specifics here. And I think in part because of what you said, that we're talking about a situation now where we're actually kind of plateaued in a lot of these metrics. We see now that, but maybe a third fewer New Yorkers are going into the office, in general, in any 5-day span. And it doesn't seem like that's going to budge much beyond that point. We've hit a sort of a ceiling there, maybe a percentage point or two, but we're in a new normal there. We see that same number almost reflected exactly in MTA ridership. We see with tourism, we've seen a real recovery, but we're still several million tourists shy of where we were annually in 2019. And all these different metrics, whether it's, foot traffic in Times Square or Broadway, tickets sold, we're at 80% or 85% of where we were in 2019, but we're not all the way back. So I want to ask a little bit more specifically about what a couple of the next steps should look like. What should the real priorities be? I'm looking at you a little bit, Jessica, because I'm thinking about Midtown and all of this. As you said, kind of compensating for less foot traffic. Well, the city benefited so enormously from a record high number of tourists. We hit that record in 2019. We haven't quite come back. So what are one or two of the specific things that we should be actually looking at that could start to make a difference in terms of enlivening Midtown streets, bringing New Yorkers back to those streets, building, as LaRosa was saying, those kind of neighborhoods where maybe it was really more single purpose. It could be land use changes in zoning. It could be, as Lisa was talking about, some conversions to office, but to residential. But it seems like the vast majority of those buildings will stay commercial one way or the other. What do we do with them? And once those 40 million square feet, I'm thinking, what else could go in there? You're talking about the value of art and entertainment. Could we use any of that space for some of the very pull factors that could bring folks back to the city or bring New Yorkers that are still here to those parts of the city where they could actually contribute economically? So I'm looking at you, Jessica, a little bit, but I want to ask everybody about this. What are one or two specific things that we could be doing, maybe starting with Midtown as the perfect kind of case study for what's needed?
Yeah. So we were just talking about this in terms of like art installations. Winston was talking about the cows. I don't know if people remember that, but I was thinking about the gates, which was huge, and that brought in 40 million visitors, $250 million in economic impact. A really, really big type of art installation could really be beneficial in just drawing people and reminding them too, how much they love New York City. I think also I'm a big proponent of bringing a casino to Manhattan, which I know is a little controversial, but I do think that that's part of sort of the placemaking. I know Winston will talk a little bit about his projects that we could be bringing something similar to that to New York. So I do think we just need some big things, some big reasons for people to come back and have fun. But the other thing does sort of go to the trying to reduce the drudgery of what that looks like coming into the city. It has to be easier to get around, obviously, and we need to think about some innovative things we can do. There was a Broadway show that in September offered free childcare at their matinee for anybody who was a ticket holder. I mean, just things like that is pretty amazing to think about. So I think we can just be doing more to make it easier for people to get into the city.
Yeah, and I will add, I would be remiss as a former city planning commissioner if I didn't say that we need zoning reform. And I think, you know, the city of New York right now through the City of Yes proposals, particularly around economic development, I mean, we need to get behind that. It takes a very long time to, you know, get to the beginning of the Euler process, and we just began the Euler process for that. So, you know, the opportunity to loosen the restrictions that are keeping businesses from occupying spaces on the ground floor, making it, I mean, right now it's difficult to, you can't dance, you know? I mean, if we're the city of fun and this is why you come to New York, you need to be able to dance, right? We need to acknowledge that, you know, in some ways we've created all of these hurdles for businesses that are not going to solve for the structural problem, which is the 25 to 30% vacancy rate, but, you know, they can help on the edges. So I think that's really, really important. And the other thing is I think we need to wake up to the fact that we do have this problem. We are not going to be able to fill all of the spaces that we have, and we need to open up our thinking into what we can put into the ground floor of these spaces. And, you know, we have a housing crisis at the same time, and I was just walking down, you know, 7th Avenue to get here, and I was struck by the ground floor. It's a Vornado building. Half of it was retail and half of it was residential on the ground floor. You know, no one's complaining that that's not a walkable street. It's a lovely street to walk. You know, Charlton here, ground floor residential. You know, we have wonderful examples of ground floor residential neighborhoods. Nobody complains that West End, you know, is residential on the ground floor with offices. You know, so I think we need to actually break that wide open and revisit our assumptions of what makes for a great ground floor, because we have an issue of vacancy, and that's the thing that's going to be a little cancerous in the city if we continue to fail to address it.
Yeah, I agree 100% that the process, I said that before, right? It's I would say it's not even the ground floor, it's the second, the third, the fourth floor,
Yes,
right?
yes.
There's many different ways to do it, but getting to yes. And so I'm a big believer in public art, in location-based entertainment, and economic development around entrepreneurship. And those things can actually be a really big aspect of helping New York with tourism, helping bring it back. And so I look at cities like Melbourne. I go down there and they have public art all over the place. It's not a program that we can point to 20 years ago and see it worked. It's actually something that's just part of the fabric of how they do business. And so we should have the gates, the cows, the thing, that should be regular. We should embrace creativity in a way that makes, in some cases, people uncomfortable, because that's actually when creativity gets to be really fun. But we need programs that don't require a patron or somebody to get behind it and push with all their might against a force of will to embrace the cows or something. It should just happen. And it should be everywhere. I mean, I talk about the bridges or the tunnels. What if they had public art around them when you're driving in the commute? What if subway stations were you could give them to art collectives or groups or sponsorship to do something fun and interesting with subway stations? I mean, the list is endless, but it should, and that's what it should be actually. The list should be endless of different ways to embrace public art in New York. It will drive tourism, it will drive jobs, it'll help with the narrative, but we need a process. And I will keep coming back to that. I don't actually know where to start with that, because we'll talk about it, but will it actually get done? And so I encourage us to really think, these ideas are all really good. We've got to be able to say yes in a way. And some people won't be happy, except that there's going to be somebody who says, I don't want this here, or that cow annoys me. It's okay. It's not about you.
There's that, yeah.
My wife will laugh when she hears this, because I'm by nature a pessimist, and I want to be a little bit of an optimist here and challenge the premise of your question, which is that we have plateaued, but I personally don't believe that that plateau is a permanent plateau. I'm just not personally a big believer that the whole remote work experiment is going to continue to play out the way that it has to date. I think there are a variety of reasons when I talk to people who run businesses, when I look at the business that I run, for believing that having people together more often in the office as opposed to having them scattered all over the place and not being able to build a culture, not being able to mentor, not being able to train, that we're going to see more people returning to the office. That being said, I do not believe that we're going to get to 100% anytime soon. And so I think what we need to ask ourselves is, how do we bend the curve so that wherever it is that we're going to end up, whether it's 80%, 70%, 90%, that we're at the top of that curve as opposed to the bottom of the potential outcomes. And that's where there are things that we can do. And I think that there are really two things that we should be thinking about. One is, I think there's a psychological issue that we have right now. There's this narrative out there that our central business districts are not places that people want to be. They're not places that people are committing to. They're not exciting. And I think there are things that we can do in the short term that can change that narrative. I would suggest, and I've believed this for a while, that we should be flooding our central business districts with police, with sanitation, with homeless services, with graffiti removal services, just to make them feel like they're not threatening places, like they're not places that are in a downward spiral. I also think that the city should consider using some of the tools that it has to try to prime the pump. I was looking at some data, and this may or may not be exactly right, but in the first 9 months of this year, there were something like 8 leases signed in the 400 million square feet of office space that we have that were over 250,000 square feet. I think it'd be worth it for the city to use the tax incentive powers that it has to try to convince some companies to make big investments, long-term investments in the city, even if it ends up being a little bit of a waste of money, because I think it's going to change the narrative. I think that's important. I think what a couple of people were talking about in terms of ways that we can bring public art to the streets and have events that can be organized relatively quickly that will, again, make Midtown, make downtown more exciting places, places that people are talking about positively. That's also important. Then there's a long-term piece of this, which I can get to later because I don't want to go on for too long, but I think that's also important. And what I would say about that, and as I said, I'll come back to this in a little bit, is that everything that we're talking about so far is about playing defense, and I think that we also have to play offense. And that's more complicated, but it's equally important.
Yeah, I have two reactions to that. I totally agree on the tax incentives, and when you talk about how it's so important to have the processes, like in the political will, we have to have the political will, and tax incentives are not super popular right now, but we have to have the political will to embrace that. I think I totally agree, and that's like a practical thing. One other super practical thing that almost feels silly to talk about, I would start by saying that, Seth, I agree with the premise that more people are coming back. I see that anecdotally every day, except for Fridays. And there is like an actual tactical thing to think about Fridays specifically, because when you think about, let's say, Midtown East, a lot of those businesses were structured, they're 5-day-a-week businesses, and that their economics were based on Monday through Friday. What if your economics are based on Monday through Thursday? That's like a different set of economics, and there are specific things. I'm not sure what the specific things are, but I think it sounds so tactical that it almost feels silly. But thinking about Fridays, I think, is going to be half the battle on the remote work situation.
So, Bruce, I'm happy to go if you want to jump in. I've also got a question that might set you up, but why don't you jump in first?
I don't know. I just want to push back on this. Our goal should be to get everybody back. I mean, when we look at, the impact on sustainability, for instance, people who are working remotely actually decrease their carbon footprint by between 11 to 58%. That's really significant. We've got a global climate crisis right now. When you look at the ability of disabled folks to be able to work and contribute, we have more disabled individuals working now in the workforce than we ever have before. The previous system, honestly, as a single mother, was impossible for me. The fact that, I can be home for my child and also do a great job at work at the same time is really, really meaningful. What happened before worked for a subset of people who had a ton of support. So, I really think if we can embrace a way that is a win-win and create that sort of economic wherewithal where what's working for our city actually enables hybrid work too, I would love to come to that place and create that solution. And that's why, finding a way to support conversions and creating a neighborhood out of Midtown, that's the direction I would really like to lean into, as opposed to saying, we'll get everybody back, because I think that system was broken.
I also think that it's great to see economic development in the neighborhoods. Like my neighborhood it's now pretty close. Like on the weekdays, there's tons of stuff happening that wasn't really happening before. I think that's an important piece of it too, but I totally agree with it.
Yeah, I was going to say, for what it's worth, if somebody who's in real estate, I don't actually think the argument is, I agree, is how do you get people back to 100%? There's economic reasons, there's practical reasons, I really do think it's more around zoning changes, what can you do with the street? Like if you want to make Friday fun, well then close some streets and have a party, right? I mean, there are things you could do to make Friday really fun. One of the reasons people aren't coming back, because I do think you do want to get people back and have the ability for people to stay home if their child's sick or if they're a single mom, is make the commute fun. That is actually, if you look at the data, what people talk about, the commute, right? That's actually a big thing. So again, let's solve the problem differently. Let's be innovative. Again, the block parties on Friday. Let's have subway cars or path cars that actually become, maybe there's a bar car, maybe there's a dance party that takes place on Friday. No, but those are, like, is there silent disco on the path? I'm making that up, but like, that's the stuff that people love.
But can I just push back on that though? Because I think we're so far from that being the solution to the problem. I mean, the commute isn't even reliable. Forget about fun. And I think our infrastructure is so broken in this city that before we can talk about having a silent disco on the path, we need to make sure that the path is actually running. And if you turn on the radio in the morning and you listen to this subway, this path, this bridge, we have to invest in our infrastructure. And this comes back to something I think that's really important. And this is a point that you've been making as well. But it's something that Jonathan said in the beginning, which is that in order for us to do any of these things, our government needs to work. And I think the fundamental underlying problem that we have in this region is that we're spending a ton of money and we're not getting good results. And it's too hard to do anything. You were saying you don't even know where to start. You can't start. It's so difficult in this city to get anything done. And I think that,
Try opening up a business, right?
Absolutely, all of those things. And so, if you really want to solve any of these problems, you start with government and you start with making government work. And I'll just, say the one statistic that to me jumps out. 10 years ago, New York City's budget was $67 billion. Today, it's $107 billion. Name one service in New York that 10 years later is 80% better than it was 10 years ago. And that's our problem.
Well, I mean, 100%.
I wanted to bring you in actually on this, Eric, because in part because Seth just started talking about, a couple folks talking about transportation, thinking about whether it's PATH or certainly the MTA. I want to actually ask you a little bit about the state's role in all of this. Thinking about your leadership role at ESD, whether it's about adding to the pluses that Seth was talking about that help make New York City more attractive to talent, taking away some of the negatives, helping the city address some of the challenges we're talking about, or investing in ways that actually help kind of meet the challenges that we're kind of framing out here today. What would you like to see the state do? What's one or two things that is the state's role?
Before I answer, I just want to enter into this last conversation and say that, in many ways, the DNA of this city is about commerce. And it's when we think about the debate about going back to the office or not, it's about going back in a purposeful way. It's about making sure that we're creating environments where, when workers are in, we're doing it in a way that makes it meaningful, not just for the work, but for the environment. If it's single mothers, you have childcare, you've got to start to rethink how we're doing it. The two reasons why people don't come back to the offices, it's commuting, and we've got to improve in commuting, and two, bad bosses. And, we can't solve all bad bosses right now, but we do need to make it easier. We do need to think about once you're in the office, and I will tell you, we had everybody in the office the last 2 days. We had a ton of meetings to catch up. Everybody walked away saying, that was worth my time. I want to be here for that. we don't want people coming back to the office and then on Zoom calls with everybody else, because that doesn't work for the company and it doesn't work for the respective employees. But, so let me just come back to yours. I think there's a number of things that, and to Seth's point, you need government working, you need the state working with the city. I think there's 4 or 5 things from the state that I would think about. One is, I think the state has a role about investing into the future. It's the large infrastructure projects, particularly, on transportation. Moynihan Station, LaGuardia, 2 big infrastructure projects that show that the city can actually do, and the state can do, big infrastructure projects. These are important public-private partnerships, but those are great models. I mean, we're going to do the 2nd Avenue subway. We did Javits to make it 500,000 square feet so any conference in the country could come to the Javits Center. So we're thinking ahead. The second thing is I think the state also needs to think about what are the jobs of the future that the state needs to invest in that the city may not do. So we've seen a lot of success. ESD had great success with Micron. We had talked to all the semiconductor companies. We brought Cree Wolfspeed. We've got so many. We're creating an industry, but it's more than that. It's also quantum computing. It's AI. It's these large new industries of the future that are needed. We need to think about talent in a different way. I mean, we need to think about what are the public-private partnerships? How are we using universities to train the next generation? And how are we getting companies involved with that to do mentorship programs, apprenticeship programs? I mean, these companies are still coming to New York because of the talent, and we've got to make sure that we are training the people of the future. And then the last comment that I'll make, which is sort of related to what Seth said, and that is what I found when I had the privilege of leading ESD was that we couldn't take it for granted that businesses wanted to be here or wanted to come to New York. And what I didn't realize was the amount of lack of confidence, call it, that the Amazon debacle had for New York. There were businesses around the country that looked at New York and said, I don't want to do business here. And we needed to go out and sell New York. We needed to go to them, and the number of conversations I had with business leaders to show them that you can do business in New York, that there's talent. We can't expect that people are just coming here just because we're New York. I mean, when the Amazon selling, went through, it was about how do we have all of the arts? How are we an inclusive environment? The diversity of what New York has to offer. We just cannot take it for granted that people are just going to show up to New York. It's selling at the highest levels. It's our leadership, it's our business leaders, it's our government leaders.
So, I mean, I agree with everybody again. But when you're getting, I think there's these micro policies, but it comes back to, I think, Seth, we were on a panel, I think you said this a long time ago, but it's a few things. I mean, if we really want New York to be competitive, it's tax structure, public safety, infrastructure, housing, right? I mean, if you want people to come and set up business here, it's got to be open for business, it's got to be a place, but I would probably add bureaucracy as the 5th pillar of that, because it's that $40 billion a year. We're not better, right? But remote work, I want to caution us, we're having this conversation like we control it. We actually don't control it. Private sector controls who comes back, not government, and not this panel in a good way. So what do we have to do to get people back? Make sure the commute's reliable, make sure it's good, make sure it's safe, make sure there's the stuff. But they're going to make the decision whether they work on Friday or not. That actually has no policy you can put in place other than we're going to give you a ridiculous tax incentive to come back, which we're not. So focus on what we can solve. Taxes, they are too high. It is so expensive to do business here. Housing, enough said, right? I mean, solve it. Literally infrastructure, and there is good examples of infrastructure. Terminal A, LaGuardia, New Kennedy, you're seeing the ports are being rebuilt. Obviously know some of this stuff. So that's exciting, but more needs to be done. We can't have rolling blackouts, brownouts, I should say, on a summer night. or a summer day, right? We've got to solve these problems. Then New York will be competitive. People will come back here. They will flock here because talent will want to be here. You can layer in the arts and all that stuff, but the big things have got to get solved.
Eric, to your point too, there's one thing that we don't have here that a lot of other international cities and frankly even mid-sized cities in the U.S. have, which is an actual dedicated office of business attraction.
Atlanta does. They have an amazing one.
London, I mean, there's,
Yeah.
you know, where they make a concerted effort, public-private partnership. It's structured in different ways in different places.
Nashville's great too.
That is one like practical idea that is smaller than your list, but is something we don't
Well,
have.
ESD has a group that spends a lot of time talking
Right.
to.
EDC also has folks who work on this, but we don't have like a dedicated point of, if you are in the private sector with an office in Europe or somewhere else and you want to come here, it's not obvious how to navigate.
Although, just to be a little bit of a contrarian, you know, when I started at EDC, that is the group that I worked in, and one of the things that occurred to me was, you know, we would put in 9 months of work, and someone would agree to locate 500 jobs in New York, and we have a 4 million job economy, and at the end of the day, that doesn't move the needle at all. And I think really the other things that we're talking about are the much more important things, that if you make the environment an environment that businesses can benefit from, if you make the environment an environment where talent wants to come, then to a certain extent the city actually does sell itself. I think that, you know, it's important to market, obviously, the advantages that we have, because especially right now there's a counter narrative that's out there. But I think at the end of the day, you can't market something that's not true. And if it's true, the marketing's not as important.
I will add, you know, before we move on, we talked about the commute a little bit, and I will say that plays into the way we move around. Our transportation system is our circulatory system. You know, we need it to work really well, and in many places, particularly the outer boroughs, you know, where we have affordable housing, there are elements that are broken. The last mile doesn't work very well. You know, I live in Jackson Heights. I live a 10-minute walk from the subway. You know, that's a stretch. You know, there are folks who live even further from the subway who rely on unreliable buses. And so what's happening at 34th Avenue, which is, you know, the open street, which is now basically an e-mobility lane. You know, I sit there, my apartment faces the street, so I've seen the street evolve over the past 3 years. So many people rely on e-mobility, and I actually got rid of my car because I cannot find parking anymore, and I bought an e-bike. And I will say it changed my life. And the city is so much smaller to me. I bike to the Lower East Side. You know, I bike over the Williamsburg Bridge. It is amazing. The safe bike lanes, you know, and I'm risk averse. You know, most people who do this right now are risk oblivious, but you know, so I want to make sure I have a safe bike lane. I want my son to be able to bike, and you know, now I know that he can. So what I've noticed, and these are really practical issues, you know, my e-bike is very expensive. I'm concerned about locking it somewhere where someone's going to steal it. So I have to figure out how to take it with me at times. You know, it's challenging to do that on the subway. You know, I have to wait for an elevator because it's very weighty. You know, in other countries, I just went to Amsterdam, they have lovely, like, runnels, you know, which is, you can walk your bike down a set of steps, you can take your bike on the train, you can take it with you. There are also very, very safe places to park your bike at the train stations, and I would love to be able to bike to the station, lock my bike up, or bring it with me and have it at the other end. I think the expansion of City Bike in Jackson Heights, which just happened in the past few months, is wonderful. You know, that gives us options. It gives people who are accessing affordable housing in these places options. It improves their commute, and it has improved my commute and made this city so much more accessible to me in so many ways. So, you know, I think that they're really practical, not particularly expensive ways in which we can improve this network that is actually broken for this new kind of mobility that is actually perfect for this city.
But, you know, and I think that, you know, everything that you're pointing out that we should be doing is exactly the cost of the inefficiency of government in New York, because the reason so many other places are able to make those kinds of improvements is because it costs less to do it in those places. The problem in New York is not that we're not spending enough money, whether it's on running our government, infrastructure, any of those things. It's that the bang for our buck is so much less. You know, it costs, I forget what the statistic is, 2-3 times as much to build a mile of subway.
5 times.
Whatever it is.
5 times
It's-
as much as Paris.
Yeah, and these are not, you know, third world cities. These are cities that have unionized labor, that have complicated underground conditions, all the things that we have. Imagine if for exactly the same money that we spent on the 2nd Avenue subway, instead of getting 3 stations, we got 15 stations. You know, a lot of your problems in Jackson Heights and a lot of the other problems that you're describing about could actually be solved because we could be expanding our transit network. And so, you know, I just think it's important for us to realize that this inefficiency in our government is not a victimless crime. It's costing every one of us in meaningful ways. And we have to attack that if we want to try to address all of these bigger underlying problems.
But how? How do we attack it?
That's a longer conversation.
Well, I was just going to say that one of the things that we've been pushing, and certainly I don't want to blame everything on the city council, but there are a lot of, there are a lot of, sometimes it seems that some city council members don't know that we're in a fight. And so they just think that we're New York and take it for granted that we're going to be okay. One of the things that we have been pushing for is for the city council to adopt an economic impact statement model whereby relevant proposals, legislation has to go through a rigorous check by unbiased economists about what the impact is going to be on jobs, small businesses. How is that going to affect the larger ecosystem? They don't do that right now.
So I just want to say, you know, obviously the more we talk, the more problems we, you know, articulate. And you know, you take housing. Obviously, housing is expensive. We need more housing. But if you go back, you know, 20 years ago, young kids would come to the city. 4 people would live in an apartment because they wanted to start in New York. I mean, we can figure. You know, we have a roadmap for, you know, housing. We know we've got to change the zoning. We know we need more density. All these things. I just want to. But in all of these issues, I think it's also important just to prioritize, just to look at the 1 or 2 things that can really move the needle. And I do think, to go back, that, you know, when you've got people that are moving, we know we have high taxes, we're not changing that tomorrow. We know we got, you know, regulatory issues, we're not changing that, you know, tomorrow. But I think if we can think about, you know, people here, people staying here, if we work on the quality of life issues, if we can make the city cleaner, we can reduce crime, I think that goes a long way to helping to solve everything else. And I would invest heavily in those 2 areas so people at least feel secure and safe, and then people feel much more comfortable commuting, going around, taking your e-bike, and all of that. So, and I'm not saying that all the other issues are not important. They're hugely important. I'm just saying you got to start somewhere and you got to prioritize.
Look, I agree, right? I mean, I think what maybe the frustration, maybe I can speak and I hear is we've talked about this and it doesn't seem to ever progress, right? So that is one of the issues of what do we do. So I think demand accountability and change, right? At some point you just have to push it. But I really do think the cost structure of New York is a real impediment, and we shouldn't, there is a reason your board 20% moved down to Miami. We're building a building down there. We see it. And we do financings down there. There is a legitimate influx of people who are moving to Miami. It is not as bad as they say, but it's real in Las Vegas.
But then they have to live in Miami.
Yeah.
I mean,
But they want to. But hold on. Wait, I'm sorry, with all due respect, that chuckle is actually the arrogance that why we're going to fail, because they do want to live in Miami. Not everybody, but I'm telling you, they do want to live in Miami. We are very, very, very active in Las Vegas. They left California. This was not 2008, where it was the speculators buying liar loans on. There was a legitimate influx of people from California because of high taxes who are now living in Las Vegas. It's not LA. It's definitely, and Vegas is a great town. It's not LA, but they're there, and they are in Miami. And so if we don't recognize Alliance Capital was a tenant of Fisher Brothers, 1 million square feet. They left New York and went to Nashville. They're going to have 180,000 square feet now in New York City. So those jobs, they went down there. Nashville is not New York City, but they're there. And that is, if we don't get those jobs back, if we don't think that we are in the fight of our life, you have to think like that because it is so fast and so mobile today. And it is changing. And so we have to be so upset that one job leaves this city and they choose someplace else. Otherwise, we are not going to be able to be competitive because these other cities, they're doing it. They're coming at us. The governors are coming up here. They're highlighting crime, but I don't think crime's actually that bad in New York, to be honest, in Midtown. I don't know if that's really the signature issue anymore. That was 2 years ago, but we gotta fight, honestly. So
I just want to jump in and kind of keep the conversation going with some of the potential solutions here, because I think we're getting into talking about playing offense, which is stuff brought up a while ago, and Winston's been talking about. You know, it strikes me that offense in New York, rather than sort of specific incentives just to bring companies here, you know, in one-off chunks, and Seth, you're talking about, you know, a lot of work would go into bringing one company that might be just a few hundred jobs. But to think about it as the offensive strategy, it seems to me, that so many of you brought this up, is around talent, is around making sure that those folks that we want to have here, that the money will chase, are actually here. And, you know, the data does concern me. I mean, I think about 13% of the folks that left the city in the pandemic actually came back. You know, that's sort of where we are with that. I was really struck, and this is actually data that Jonathan mentioned earlier from analysis by the Citizens Budget Commission, that showed that the biggest, of all the age groups in New York City, the biggest groups that left the city are millennials, and closely followed by Gen Z. You know, that strikes me as really concerning for a city which is so dependent on talent, where we're losing a lot of New Yorkers under 40. And a big part of that, obviously, for millennials and Gen Z is affordability. You know, whether you're talking about
And education.
So trying to understand a little bit more, absolutely, and so, you know, for the you know, millennial making the decision, how can I afford to raise a family here, and do I want to raise a family here, and what are the things that the city needs to offer to make that doable? So I want to kind of just bring it back to that playing offense. To me, I think that really does mean focusing on these fundamentals that make the city attractive for people that want to live here. You touched briefly on transit. It makes sense to me that we're talking in part about things that we haven't done in a city with a radial transit network built 100 years ago. How do we help people connect within boroughs? You know, but it also strikes me that we're talking about things like parks and open space, culture, which we talked about a little bit at the beginning, but kind of coming back to that. So I'd love to kind of challenge everybody here. What are one or two things that the city should be focused on? Maybe to Eric's point, it's kind of helping us prioritize. Or I'm open to just one or two things in general that would help us actually play offense in those areas where we can really make a difference.
Again, I want to build on the education piece. I think it's key with regard to raising families here, but there's, I mean, obviously that goes without saying. But I think there's two other pieces too. Eric, you talked a bit about workforce development. Eli, you teed up apprenticeships. We haven't spent a lot of time on that. There's so much the city and the state should be doing. Like, it's great that we're working hard and talking about how to attract jobs. We have to make sure those jobs are, New Yorkers get those jobs. So, you know, that could be panel upon panel to talk about that. The other thing that I think we don't do a great job and I'm spending some time thinking about and working on too, is that we have really, really amazing post-secondary institutions here. And we don't do a good job of, frankly, telling the story of what that looks like as a whole. So, again, speaking from tech, that's where I work. You know, people talk about Stanford and they talk about MIT, but they don't really talk about any single institution in New York. And I'm pretty convinced, though I don't have the data, if you were to talk about all the institutions here globally, our numbers would blow those schools out of the water. So really thinking about how we, New York is full of competitive people, and I think that's great. I think that's one of the things that drives New York, but finding ways where we can work together on things like that, I think would also really help benefit New York.
I mean, if it's a micro idea, I love location-based entertainment is great for storefront retail, great for office space, which is everything from art pass-through experiences to darts. Or London has an amazing program for startups to create location-based entertainment companies, and they have very simple, easy-to-follow rules to get tax funding rebates for that. If we could do something that was efficient and encouraged job formation in the creative sector, and it was not 32 different forms, that would be an amazing micro idea that could actually help bring energy and vitality and create jobs in New York.
I mean, we have to make sure the zoning allows for those things, and we need to eliminate the impediments that exist right now. So again, it's just super practical. Let's just make sure we pass City of Yes. If you know, I think that's really important. You know, and on the education front, as my son, for those of you who are in the middle of this. Today is the SHSAT test day. I hope everyone is doing okay, but my son is literally sitting in this test right now that's going to determine whether he's able to go to a specialized high school here in New York. And the process of, I know too many parents who are really overwhelmed by this process of getting their kids through this educational system in New York and have actually left, as a result. If you have the wherewithal to send your children to private school, good for you, but if you have to rely on the public school system, which many of us do, it's incredibly daunting and challenging, and, this is your child's future that's at stake. So it's part of this calculus, is it worth it to stay in New York? Many people decide, no, it's not, especially millennials who are at that point in their lives where they're having children and making these decisions. So I think that's got to be part of the calculus as well.
Sorry, go ahead, Sandy.
No, I was just going to say, I think the number is something like 100,000 fewer kids in the public schools now than there were before the pandemic, and trying to figure out why that is, because that's a big red flag, I think. And as you said, public education and really excellent public education is key to bringing to keeping families and the talent that comes with families in the city. Another thing I would just add is that I remember in 2008 when we were trying to figure out how to recover from the Great Recession, which at this point seems like such a quaint problem. One of the things that we adopted in the Bloomberg administration was that we set a very ambitious goal. We decided that we wanted to make New York the 21st century capital of innovation. And to be honest, when we started, I'm not sure any of us really knew exactly what that meant, but it sounded good. It sounded ambitious. And what we started to do was experiment with lots of little programs, and actually Eric was involved with many of these, that allowed us to do two things. One is we started to see what was working, what was getting traction, which industries we actually had a competitive advantage in. And two was just the constant flow of new initiatives started to give people confidence that something was happening that was positive. And I think if we were to set a similar ambitious goal at this point in time and adopt a similar policy where you're doing lots of little things at first to kind of figure out what exactly makes the most sense, and then you start doubling down and tripling down on the things that are working and start going bigger, that's something else that we could consider. And I want to come back to something that Eric actually said at the beginning, which is, I've thought a lot about Jack Welch. When he was CEO of GE, he had a rule that every one of the business divisions had to be the second or third, in the top 2 or 3 in the world, I think it was, in whatever it was that they did. And I think that we should pick a handful of industries that we know are going to be the industries of tomorrow, whether it's artificial intelligence or bioscience or whatever, and we should set as an ambition for ourselves that we in New York are going to be one of the top 2 or 3 centers of those industries, and then start really investing and prioritizing those industries and trying to make sure that New York's economy continues to have the diversity that it has today, and is a leader internationally as it's been for so much of our history.
That's amazing stuff. I mean, at the time, it seemed so intentional. So that's amazing to hear that, how you guys are going about it. We are seeing a huge entrepreneurial boom right now. We need to lean into that, support them, do everything we can, because that's where the economy of tomorrow is going to come from. It's great.
So Jessica, on that optimistic note, actually, I want to turn it over to our audience for some questions. I think there's a lot of folks, they've got a lot that they want to ask you all about. I would just say, as folks, raise your hands. I'll look around, make sure I see everybody. Keep your hands up. We're going to come around to you, our team, with microphones, so we can hear you. Please just say your name and any affiliation, and please try to keep your questions short so we can kind of get to as many folks in the room as possible. So starting in the back, come for a microphone. I'll keep my eyes peeled, and we'll go do hands again after the question. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm Allie Margolis, Director of Career Pathways and Public Policy at NYU School of Professional Studies. I guess I'm looking more for reactions on 2 noticings. One, I think the comment about graffiti removal and increased policing, that keeps a certain demographic of people out and another demographic of people in. And so I'm wondering how we make art and how we make social services, in addition to policing, part of that process. I think the second one that it felt a little tone deaf, to be honest, and minimized, is childcare, and childcare being some sort of single women's issue. If you're wondering why millennials are leaving, majority of millennial families are two-parent working households. They can't care for their dog, care for their kids, and literally get to work, let alone having a safe environment at work. And so I just want to name that with more and more homes being two-parent homes, with college-going women outpacing college-going men, with more men being caretakers or playing a more prominent role in caretaking, what if parents could drop their kids off next door to work? What if people could drop their dogs at doggy daycare centers next to work? What if employees had these benefits baked into their benefits packages? What if there are more urgent care centers next to businesses? So children who are sick at the daycare centers next door to work can now drop their kids off at doctor's offices next to work. What if daycare, et cetera, doggy daycare centers had tax incentives, grants, et cetera, to open up there? What if daycare centers used a Reach University model to actually increase economic mobility and social mobility by upskilling paras, which are majority of Black women, into teaching roles to solve the teacher crisis? And what if we used a similar approach for healthcare? So I'm just wondering, I guess, why childcare is not more prominent in the main reason for solving this problem and even attracting talent far beyond New York City. Thanks.
So for what it's worth, I actually wrote a book, and one of the 5 pillars of economic for a bold agenda to help the middle class is 0 through 5, right? It is, child care is a signature economic issue for society where the cost is astronomical, and it's keeping mostly single women or families, but it affects everybody, right? So, but in New York, let's get to that. It's not, I'm not saying it as a, I mean, it's a signature issue that the cost of childcare is prohibitive and it is keeping people out of the workforce. So I'm agreeing. But then get to New York. You can't put childcare like above the first floor. So by law, you can't put childcare on the 3rd or 4th or 5th floor. So that's, and this has been an issue that's been talked about. I've said it to every political leader I know. So why? I get it. Maybe there's something with the fire department. I'm not trying to be tone deaf about safety for a child on the 3rd floor, but right, at some level, that's the bureaucracy. That's actually, it's not that people won't do it, it's the system doesn't allow it to happen, let alone then where funding comes from and stuff like that. So I encourage everybody here, business owners, real estate owners would love to have childcare in their space. Not that they're running it themselves, but there's got to be practical liability. You got to be able to get people, and you got to be able to put it in your building. And so that's the issue, if you really want to get to it, of how do we make it so that it can be around. We focus on somehow it's not happening. It's because it can't happen. That's a bigger issue.
Also, employers are not all created equal in that you have large corporations who invest very heavily in providing a lot of the services to retain that top level of staff. But smaller businesses, although they often want to support their employees as much as possible, it's just cost prohibitive. So this really is something that has to be dealt with at a larger level, as a public-private initiative, looking at how this can work. Businesses of different sizes, but government has to be at the table as well.
Has to be.
Thanks. Okay, we'll just see hands again. Thanks for the question, and just make sure I'm not missing anybody. Okay, so we'll go first right there in the 3rd row. We'll come over to the other side, and we'll come back. Thank you.
Thanks. This has been very interesting. The conversation, red tape, bureaucracy keeps coming up again and again. And I'm curious to get the panelists' thoughts on the levers we can use as business leaders, government employees, nonprofit employees, to sort of start to address that, because it seems like there's very little that actually is going to change until we can make headway there, and it's not obvious how to do so.
Did anyone vote yesterday?
Yeah,
I mean, nobody votes. Nobody votes in this town on those type of elections that are not on the presidential side. So that's, well, but if people voted, wouldn't. Sure. But I don't know, that's just a start. I just wanted to highlight that.
Well, also, and also, I don't think that generally the press pays attention to, the mechanics of government. They pay attention to the legislation that somebody's proposing or somebody's passing. And I think you need the press to pay attention to it. You need our leaders to say, yeah, this is actually important. I know it's dry to talk about regulation and to talk about all the different layers of red tape that are required in New York City. And then, as you were saying, we as voters need to actually care about that. Right. And we need to vote on it, and we need to vote for people who are prioritizing it. And that's how you'll get change.
I also think, a lot of these policy decisions are really in the weeds, and it is organizations like Center for Urban Future and RPA, Regional Plan Association, that are really helping to drive the policy conversations that then inform the actions of government. And so, us even being here and being part of this conversation and supporting an organization like this is really critical. So, identifying what those structural issues are, which we have. This has been a great conversation. There have been at least half a dozen suggestions and ideas that have come out of this, which I think are really critical. The financing that we need to support the conversions that we know are happening, the flexibility in the zoning code that needs to occur, issues of transit access and fixing this last mile have come up, and then sort of setting the stage and acknowledging that we're going from, this is a moment of tremendous disruption. We're going from the business district, the downtown business district, central business district, to something that needs to become a neighborhood, needs to become more mixed use. And how do we pivot and make sure that the amenities are there to support that value proposition, I think, are really critical.
Can I just, on top of all this, obviously, especially everything that was just said, I completely agree with. But the amazing thing about New York is that while this is hard and expensive, we have models here. We have done it. Like Lower Manhattan, we haven't really talked about that yet today, but it is amazing what is happening there. What grew literally from the ashes of September 11th.
With tremendous subsidy.
Right. It was not cheap or easy, but I feel like part of what is so amazing about I did not grow up here. I think there's also this thing in the zeitgeist where we talk about, people are so proud of being born and bred here. That's amazing. I'm raising my kids here. But people come here because they want to be a part of it, and that is such an amazing thing. Problem solvers, it brings a certain type of person. I'm not necessarily one of those, but and that's an amazing thing about New York. We do know how to do big things here. It's hard. It is so hard, but we do them. And I just feel like I'm meandering a bit here, but I want to say that I love New York. I'm here because I love it and I want to make it better, and I know that I am so far from alone in that, and I feel really optimistic, actually. As messy as it is along the way, I feel quite optimistic about New York.
I just wanted to add two things, and a little bit off topic, but first of all, we're dealing with such complex, intractable problems that it does require the we, and that is, I have found that the most successful things that we've done in this city are public-private partnerships. We need the smartest people around the table. These issues are more complex. They take more time. Seth brought up, some of the issues around in the Bloomberg administration. Cornell Technion came about because there was a concerted effort to go and talk to everybody, not just in the business sector, in nonprofit, in education, consultants, to ask people what are the most important ideas. And the idea of having an applied science university rose to the top. Did anybody think that a new university would come about in New York with the cost that we have in the building? But that was from the creativity of people here in New York. And we've got to think big. The other thing is we have to also accept that we're going to make mistakes, but we need to act. A good example is Alexandria. The idea behind Alexandria was that it was going to be for all these small life science companies. Didn't turn out to be that. It turned out to be much larger pharmaceutical companies. NYU took some space, but it led to the beginnings and helping in terms of life science. We've got to, get to a point where we're stopping thinking about every micro thing and start getting things implemented and accept the fact not everything's going to be right, but there's something else is going to turn out and be good for the city.
Thanks, Thanks, Eric. So I think we had a question here in the fourth row. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Great, fantastic conversation. Carolyn Grossman-Marr, Director of Economic Development at City Planning. Thank you, Larissa, for the shout-outs to City of Yes for economic opportunity. I guess I want to build on the last question that we had about political levers, because, it strikes me that, for those of us in government, those many on stage, former government, there's not a lot here that we wouldn't all agree with in this room, right? And yet there's this enormous disconnect, I think, when you try to make the changes that we all think of as maybe common sense, through a political process that's responding to very different kinds of inputs. Things, for instance, on the stage we said, it's obvious that we should all allow dancing in a city that's trying to invigorate its nightlife. I can tell you this week alone, as we're out talking to communities about City of Yes, the feeling in many of our communities is quite the opposite, and I think is much more sympathetic to the ideas that we're saying, that, the quality of life concerns of making it easier for businesses to locate in the city. People would associate that with the reasons they're leaving, right? The same, I think, for housing. Many of the things we see around increasing housing supply as a panacea to affordability, are perceived still in our communities as disruptive and destabilizing of the things that would have them stay. Last night alone, we saw, a council member who lost her seat probably for taking a tough vote on allowing 100 units of affordable housing in the Bronx. And I wonder what the panel thinks, where the opportunities are for trying to bridge this disconnect between the civic and business culture of the city that I think sees the urgency and some real clarity on what steps are necessary, and just the challenge that that's not necessarily resonating with how the populace of the city feels post-pandemic.
Is it the populace of the city, or is it the vocal minority? I mean, just to be fair, some things you have to do that aren't popular because they're right? And so I do wonder it's upsetting that a council member loses their seat for voting for 100 units of affordable, and at the same time, I would argue, I don't think the answer is that don't do affordable, right? That would seem like a crazy conclusion. It's the people who voted her out are wrong, not her. So we've got to actually create a system where it's actually not about a few people in a primary, which how many people actually voted, that, huh? But how many, excuse me, it was but it
18,000 people voted in that district last
10%.
10%, it's pretty small, right? And so we probably need how much housing in that district? So I think at some point we have to have a system that doesn't just allow that to happen. I wish I had the answer, right? Because you want to wave your magic wand, but we need government reform. We need to prioritize spending, right? You asked, how do you change things? We actually you have to wield some pretty tough levers on spending. And if people don't get results, they don't get funding anymore, right? Like this doesn't happen by being nice. This happens by doing what's right and a force of will to actually allow the city to be competitive. And I realize that's a harsh way to look at it, but that is actually the way. This is a behemoth, and if we don't force change to this behemoth of government, we're not going to get change.
Well, and I would also say that I think for good reason, we moved away from a system that made it very easy to do large-scale development after the abuses of Robert Moses and other people like that in New York's history. But I think the problem is that we've now overcorrected. Right. And what ends up happening is that a few vocal stakeholders can derail something that's in the larger interest of the city. Right. And so I think, this comes back to the point about making government work. I think we have to restrike the balance. And, I forget whoever was asking, so, what's the solution? I mean, this is an example of what the solution is. We need to come up with a process where certainly everybody's voices are heard, and if something comes up that's truly concerning in that process, that things that shouldn't happen don't happen, but we can't have a process that basically allows essentially anyone to derail everything.
Well, I mean, a lot of things that probably don't have to go through the urban land use review process right now end up going through ULURP, which is, expensive and time consuming. And I remember, a business came up for a special permit for a sign, on 7th Avenue on Ladies Mile. And I asked the question, how much is it costing you to go through this process to put some fluttering banners up? And they said $50,000. That's not within the realm of possibility for a small business who probably needs a sign like that. So it's striking this balance between, what really, requires discretion, and what can be, as of right and driven by data. I mean, we're, Bloomberg alums as well, that moment in time, it was a very data-driven moment in time, which, things got done, and sometimes there was, at the expense of community input. So it's finding that balance, but I do think we need to be mindful about what should be discretionary and what isn't.
So I'll just say, because I see Jonathan moving, that we raised all of the problems here, but on the next panel with Hope and Andrew, we're going to solve everything.
They're going to talk about the solutions.
Got them all.
Well, that's the perfect segue, Eric. So why don't everybody join me in a round of applause for this amazing first panel. Thank you all so much. And don't go anywhere. We're going to move directly into the second panel, so stay tuned, and we'll start right now.
All right, we are going to move right into the second panel. So if Hope and Andrew can join us on the stage. Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. Hello, good morning. Yeah, why don't you both sit closest to me? Actually, I'm going to switch because we might as well sit in the middle. Is that okay? Yes. All right. That way more people, I think, will be able to see. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Hey, thanks so much for joining us. I feel like this is, I don't know if you heard, but Eric really kind of set you up to have all of the answers. We've got a few challenges facing our city, but I think this next half hour we're going to get to some concrete solutions. Seriously, I think, Eli, introduced our previous panelists, but I think that both of you need really no more introduction than, let me say, we've got the heads of the state and the city's economic development agencies, obviously Andrew Kimball, Hope Knight. They are really fantastic leaders for the city and the state. They've been at it, not just in their current jobs running these agencies, but for so long, both of them have really been kind of really amazing innovators and anchors for communities, for our city. And I've just loved over the years talking with you about ideas and about getting stuff done. So it's so great to have you both here today. I also should add that for the first time, I think, in a long time, we have such a strong relationship between the city and the state on economic development, which is really exciting. There's always been great people, but I think in part because of relationships with mayors and governors, that hasn't always been the case. We've heard on the last panel a lot of the challenges our city faces. We know that, and I think we started off by saying, like, there's some real positives for this city. We know that we just hit the mark for recovering all the jobs lost during the pandemic. It was said during the last panel, we're in this entrepreneurial boom right now in New York City. There's a lot of good things happening, but we do have these really, significant challenges that have emerged or accelerated since the pandemic. But I wanted to give you both a chance to kind of talk about, you know this is happening, these issues are out there, and I'd like to hear just what are a couple of things that your agencies are doing right now to try to get on top of these competitive threats facing New York City, and what would you like to tell us about? Hope you want to start?
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here with friend and colleague Andrew. So I'll talk about a couple of initiatives that we're working on. First, talk about something called the SSBCI, which is the Small Business Credit Initiative. New York State was awarded $502 million by the Department of Treasury to support small businesses, and specifically economically, historically disadvantaged businesses. And we have developed a series of programs across low-cost debt, venture programs, and we will work in partnership with the private sector to leverage that $502 million 10 times to be a $5 billion initiative over 10 years. And so we're very excited about that to sort of fuel the entrepreneurial ambition of the people of this state. Secondly, and something that, Andrew and I have been working hand in glove together on is life sciences. We believe that life sciences can be a significant job engine for this city and state. And we had a couple of big announcements over the last couple of weeks. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, a $300 million program that will be focused on leveraging relationships with incredible research institutions that we have in this region and trying to solve some of the most significant medical problems that we face. Also, another project that we've worked on together, the $700 million Tasty Lab building that was opened last year, purpose-built for life sciences. And then something that we're calling the Lab of the Future, a initiative that will really focus on autonomous AI and machine automation to really look at how do you solve preclinical drug discovery in a more data-driven and cost-effective way. And then lastly, I'll mention our film and television tax credit. We had a $420 million film and tax credit program around for quite some time. And what we noticed was that our neighbors to the east and west were really being very competitive with their programs, so we increased that program to $700 million in tax credits per year. I think the reason why this is very important to the city and state's economy, 57,000 employment opportunities are created with that program, and those are direct opportunities. There are another, almost the same amount in indirect. And I can say that when I worked at Greater Jamaica, we were involved in a couple of these productions and supporting them with locations, et cetera. And you can really see the kinds of economic activity that are afforded by the local, locksmiths and dry cleaners and caterers. So really significant economic activity from the industry. Just a footnote, unfortunately, the actors are still on strike and we haven't seen the activity that we'd like, but we're hoping that that comes to a close shortly and that activity continues.
Absolutely. Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, it starts, it's not just that Hope and I like each other and like to geek out on economic development, but our bosses demand that we work in collaboration. I can't emphasize that point enough, having been in and around economic development for 30 years, how dysfunctional things have been in the past, and that is really creating a roadmap, I believe, on this recovery. So, you mentioned the all-time jobs number. Obviously, that is good news. It should be celebrated. Other data that we highlight on a monthly basis, and if you haven't signed up for our economic snapshot, I encourage you to do that. But there is an all-time workforce participation rate high in New York right now, highest since 1976. 1 in 7 businesses in New York are created in the last 12 months. It sounds like you highlighted that on the last panel, but I would say of note, when we came in a couple years ago and you mapped where those businesses were, and this is something Cuff has been very good at pointing out over years, but they are heavily clustered along the Brooklyn-Queens waterfront. So having spent 20 years on the Brooklyn waterfront, I'm obviously proud of that, but that highlights a problem, which is not enough dots in Lower Manhattan and Midtown. And a lot of that led to the work of the new New York report. So, while we feel good about the direction, it's obviously unacceptable that Black unemployment is 3 times white unemployment. It's a real challenge that we have 100 million square feet of vacant office space today. So we got work to do. And the new New York report put together by the mayor and the governor and ESD and EDC really lays out that roadmap. And it's not just a plan sitting on a shelf. Like, we are taking action. We are moving on conversion of buildings that have the right typology for conversion from office to residential. We obviously have one track with the state legislature. It is disconcerting that they've sat on their hands on this for a year. We're going to be pushing it again in the next session, but the city is moving on its own with the City of Yes and Housing for All proposals that DCP has put forward to allow for some of those conversions. We rolled out our MCORE program a few months back that targets buildings south of 59th Street pre-2000, where the landlords are prepared to invest 75% of the assessed value, bring it up to local law 97, incorporate our innovation sectors. Again, our sectors are the sectors that CUF has called out as the growth sectors, but, you know, green economy, tech more broadly, biotech, we're working in partnership. And if they do that gut renovation, they add incubators and accelerators, they create a dynamic floor plane in the building, right? So think art, think culture, think more interactive types of retail. We will lock in their real estate taxes for the next 25 years. It is a very generous benefit. We think it'll be a real shot in the arm. We've been overwhelmed with application interest, and we're going to announce those first buildings in January. You know, it's important to note also in New York that it is not just a midtown and downtown plan. It focuses on transit-oriented development, again, taking action, a $500 million plan around transit-oriented development in Broadway Junction, a big focus, again, with the state on Morris Park and the extension of the 4 Metro North lines and moving a rezoning through there that'll create not only more housing, but really an eds and meds focus around the schools there. Obviously, Hope mentioned the exciting news around CZI. We're also working very closely on the Spark project on 25th and 1st, where we're going to be rolling out the updated master plan in the next few days with the mayor and the governor, and a timeline that gets us into construction in 2025. It really is a major statement about equity and our workforce development strategy, where you've got 3 CUNY schools, a 2-year, a 4-year, and a graduate school, all focused on public health, biotech, a STEM high school on one half of the 5 acres, and 1 million square feet of private biotech on the other half, with locked-in workforce development strategies that get those young students into that private space, get those entrepreneurs into the schools on one campus, also links it to the other 3 million square feet of space of life sciences that are growing at Kips Bay. So that's just a few of the things. I just want to mention one more on the equity front, because you know, we collectively feel so passionate about this, and you've highlighted some of this data too, but while we do quite well on the diversity front in our innovation sectors from a percentage point of view in terms of people of color in those sectors when you compare it to our competitor cities, we are no better when it comes to VC investment. 1% of all VC investment goes to black founders, 1.5 to Latino founders. That is not acceptable. EDC has rolled out a number of programs in recent months. One is the Venture Alliance, where over 100 VCs have committed to not only diversifying their workforce, but investing in fund managers, investing in startups. And we put out a report that showed the data to back that up, which is if you make those investments, you are likely to have a higher return. We have a Founder Fellows program now that has over 200 diverse entrepreneurs, again, in the innovation sectors we care about, where we're mentoring, connecting to VCs, and the list goes on that front.
Well, you both have quite a lot going on, so congrats. It's impressive. You know, I want to say a lot of what you mentioned, but not all of it. Both of you talked a little bit about things that I think are laying the groundwork for an even more diverse economy. And you weren't here probably from my opening remarks, but I think I mentioned what excites me or gets me kind of most heartened about the city's economy right now is it feels to me like we're the most diverse economy we've ever been in New York City. And I think the things that you mentioned around film, around life sciences, and other stuff, is really helping to diversify the economy even more and make it more resilient in the face of a lot of the challenges we're facing today. And obviously also around entrepreneurship and supporting small businesses, because we do have a more entrepreneurial economy, and that also makes us kind of a more resilient economy, giving more people options for wealth creation. I guess though, coming back to the first panel that we just had, there was a lot of discussion about these new forces that are really kind of shaping the post-pandemic economic landscape. And I think, with remote work especially, I think a lot of us, CUF included, and my colleagues and I at CUF, is this, kind of concern about one of the things that's been so critical to really the city's economic success over the past 20 or 30 years was really being able to attract and retain so many highly educated people from across the country and around the world. And, data that just came out recently suggests that, a lot of folks with bachelor's degrees, with advanced degrees, have been the movers in the last couple of years. Remote work makes people more mobile than ever. I'm just curious, do these things concern you as you look at kind of in your perches as kind of, overseeing the economic development of our city? And what are some of the things that you're either doing or that you feel like we ought to do as a city to make sure we can kind of keep that talent advantage?
So I think, from the state's perspective, we are really focused on innovation and jobs of the future. So really keeping our eye on, where do we need to be? Who do we need to have to participate in this economy for it to grow? And when I think about I know that Micron was discussed in the earlier panel, but that's a really significant initiative, and it will have benefits for generations to come. And so when you think about the engineers and the PhDs that will be needed for the semiconductor industry, you think about the other supply chain companies that will come because of it, I think that will be a magnet to really attract and keep people here in New York City, New York State. And so, we're focused on really, having New York become the global hub of semiconductors. And although the chip making will largely happen upstate, a lot of design and advances in the industry will probably happen downstate.
Great. Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I really applaud the governor and ESD on their work around Micron and around the whole, nanotechnology industry. Things are moving so fast. I think there is an opportunity around workforce in the city. Two areas where we see a real need to focus is, things are moving so fast around AI. And all sectors are embracing that. That's a real opportunity. Certainly guardrails have to be put in place, and the mayor announced a recent plan with OTI around some of those and the use of AI in government. We believe the place where there clearly is consensus about opportunity to do good is the intersection of AI and science. And how it can really transform the speed at which we discover new cures, new drugs, we extend lives, and really have an impact. So that's an area we're very focused on. I would say the other area where we see enormous opportunity is the green economy. So just going back to 2008, very few tech jobs, now 350,000, close to 100,000 life sciences jobs. Green economy, a little bit fewer jobs, but if you look at every projection of where things are going, that's where the bulk of the jobs are going to be, in part because of the new regulatory frameworks, our push to move hard towards getting off fossil fuels. We think there's a real opportunity to build on the small business boom and really focus it on not just software related to climate innovation, but hardware, and an opportunity to take places like the Brooklyn Army Terminal. We're working very closely with NYSERDA, again, the state, on some of these efforts, and Climate Fight to make sure that that is a thriving hub for these kinds of makers around climate. We announced some pilots recently. And you think about what the New Lab did for the Navy Yard. There's no reason we can't have that kind of dynamic incubator accelerator ecosystem at the Brooklyn Army Terminal focused on climate innovation. I'll just say I didn't read that study. I have no doubt that a very significant portion of highly educated New Yorkers and wealthier New Yorkers chose to work remotely during the pandemic. I did ask my team on the way over here just to check the numbers of bachelor's degrees, 2019 and today. There are 125,000 more bachelor degrees in New York City than there were in 2019. So yes, there may have been a moment. Do we need to be concerned about remote work? 100%. Does that have a ripple effect on vacant office space? Of course, and that's why we're pursuing some of those other initiatives.
Got it. So, you're, I mean, to what extent are you worried about this? You know, I mean, remote work does seem like it just kind of makes people more mobile. And I guess maybe what I'll do is ask a question that frankly I've been dying to ask. You know, we heard on this first panel about a lot of the things that really matter in terms of what's going to attract or keep people in New York. And it really kind of occurred to me, it's kind of striking that so many of those things, you know, transit, housing, public art came up a bunch of times, and art in general, the creativity of the city, open space, you know, even the kind of cleanliness issues that kind of come up again and again, things that matter and that kind of are influencing whether people come or leave from New York. They all matter for the city's economy, and I think we heard on the first panel that those might be the most important things right now. But they're not really necessarily in the portfolio of our economic development leaders in New York City and New York State. I mean, am I right about that? And like, how do we make sure that we address those things?
Should I start on this one? I mean, you know, they are squarely within our mandate. You know, I'll say when I started, I traveled nationally, teeny bit of international travel, but I would hear overwhelmingly four concerns really. One, starting with crime. I don't hear that as much anymore. That doesn't mean there's not crime issues, but there is a perception and I think a reality that that is under control. People are getting back on the subways. We're not quite to where we want to be, but it's moving in the right direction. The second was, do you have a plan in this post-COVID world? And I think we have that in New York. And the third, you know, was really housing. So those are the main three. I would say today I hear almost solely about housing. And so, you know, that is to me the single biggest challenge. EDC does a lot to facilitate housing, working with our colleagues at HPD and HDC. And a perfect example is the Willets Point project that's in a rezoning right now to create the largest 100% affordable housing community in 40 years. Built on top of what had been a trash heap for 100 years. So housing, really critical. I would say the other thing I'd add to your list that you didn't mention, I'll go back to the diversity of our entrepreneurs and our workforce. You know, we have to be mindful of other cities that are doing very well in this space, like Atlanta, and really driving diverse entrepreneurship. And, you know, in addition to the great colleges they have surrounding Atlanta, that is one of the reasons that you see a lot of big tech companies expanding, growing in Atlanta. We need to make sure, obviously we've done well with big tech ourselves, we got to keep our eye on the ball because honestly, in my view, that is one of the reasons young people from around the world want to be in New York City. They want the quality of life, but they want to be in a diverse environment that kind of matches their hopes and aspirations and ethics around equity and diversity.
Yeah, and you know, I would agree with what Andrew said, you know, around, you know, culture and entrepreneurship, being able to attract venture firms here. But housing really is something that the governor's focused on and has brought ESD into the fold with thinking about how do we execute against that. My real estate team has been working on the redevelopment of some state-owned facilities. We have RFPs out for 2 prisons, Bayview in Chelsea and Lincoln in Harlem. We also have an RFP out for Site K right across the street from Javits. And we're involved in World Trade Center Site 5 1,200 units, 400 of them will be affordable. So we definitely have leaned into the housing production business.
I mean, you mentioned the governor, and I think, Andrew, you mentioned Mayor Adams. Obviously, both have really come out with ambitious housing proposals. Obviously, they haven't gotten as far as we'd like. Maybe that's an understatement, but I guess any thoughts on how we break the logjam, or what is it we can do as a city on our own with housing? I mean, you're mentioning specific projects, which is obviously one way we can kind of move forward, but are there other ways that maybe without the legislature, obviously let's not give up trying to get this through Albany, but are there things that we ought to be doing as a city or to kind of move this forward, because housing is maybe the number 1, 2, and 3 issue right now, especially around affordability?
Well, from the state's perspective, I think it's very difficult to produce affordable housing without a program. And so we really do have to encourage the legislature to advance some sort of 421A-like program so that we can get back to producing housing in the numbers that we have in the past.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with that statement. There are things that we are undertaking on our own, led by Department of City Planning, obviously with support of EDC, City Hall, but the Housing for All plan, which is part of the City of Yes set of initiatives that are going to begin to work their way through the public process, have to go through ULURP and get approved by the City Council, not the state legislature. But the Housing for All plan, I really encourage people to check it out, because it does call on all neighborhoods to act and to take on their fair share, and also opportunity. So we often talk about dense clusters around transit-oriented development. Both the mayor and the governor have been, I think, great on that topic. But there are so many downtown commercial strips, particularly in areas that have done well during COVID, because people do want to work closer to home, like Jamaica or Broadway Junction or the North Shore of Staten Island, where you've got 1 or 2 story retail, where you should have the ability to put 3 or 4 or 5 stories of housing above that. We're not talking about skyscrapers, but if collectively you looked at all those commercial hubs, you could add 40,000 units of housing. I mean, that's the kind of thing we're taking action on at the city level under Mayor Adams' leadership.
Awesome. Another issue we talked about on the first panel, which, this forum today, this event is really around, hey, we've got some new and accelerating challenges, some of which we didn't really confront, some of which really hit at the heart of our advantages in New York City. And obviously, we've heard a lot about what the new New York panel is doing around the central business districts, around Midtown especially. I guess, I get that there's this effort, MCOR and other things, to try to convert office buildings into housing. Fantastic, right? Obviously needs to happen. I think there's questions about how many of those office buildings will be able to do that. But beyond that, I wonder if each of you could talk about, what's your vision for a kind of the office district or the Midtown of the future, and how do we get there, right? So, for instance, Ed Glazer wrote an op-ed in the Times several months ago that he talked about New York as a playground city. And, that phrase might be not quite the right one for New York, but the idea that we may not have as many people coming to offices every day, but we still have a lot of foot traffic. And that's kind of maybe the future. So how do we support that, whether it's with open spaces or other amenities? Winston talked about public art and other things. What's your vision for Midtown, and what specifically do we need to do to get there?
Yeah, it's live, work, learn, and play. It's got to be all those things. We're in a global competition with other major cities around the world, because this same phenomenon is happening elsewhere. Having the kinds of improved public realm, and the mayor recently announced the next phase of the greening of Broadway. There is a design master planning process underway right now with a number of bids in the private sector to look at greening, widening the sidewalk on Fifth Avenue from the library all the way up to the park. Could have a transformational impact and hopefully those businesses at the ground floor react to that with more dynamic, interactive kinds of retail. So that is super critical, I think, to long-term success, and we're trying to do similar things around the city. I mentioned Broadway Junction, Jamaica, Morris Park, but North Shore, Staten Island, we just announced a $400 million plan with money that is in construction right now to create a 20-acre green ribbon along the waterfront from Stapleton to just past the ferry landing, comparable to the Brooklyn waterfront, comparable to the Hudson River Park. That kind of investment from the public side can generate enormous private investment upland.
And Hope, I mean, your experience most recently with Jamaica, it strikes me as much as there are challenges facing the central business districts like Midtown, there are also opportunities to go on the offensive and to really take advantage of some, more people working at home or close to home for the boroughs outside of Manhattan, for districts not in Midtown or downtown. What are some things that you think we ought to be doing, or that you're maybe already doing, to really take advantage of the fact that more people are living and working in the other boroughs, and really make New York a better place to both live and work?
I think doing some of the things that we're talking about doing in Midtown, which is creating, more investment in the public realm. We have a program called the Downtown Revitalization Initiative, the DRI, and those investments have typically gone to places like Jamaica and Chinatown, East Harlem, focusing on very specific interventions that make quality of life better for the people who live, work, and play in those communities.
Can you give us an example of what's one kind of thing that Jamaica or Chinatown or others can get or should be trying to do to I guess, make them stronger and to take advantage of this moment?
And so a couple of things about Jamaica, because I know about that. Created a co-working space so people could actually have a place to go in that community to work, and they hadn't had one there before. We had a small restaurant investment fund to help, emerging entrepreneurs create small restaurants. There was a food hall that we created, an incubator space to have rotating food entrepreneurs be able to get their start there. So little interventions like that can help communities really grow.
Wonderful. Well, another issue that's kind of a big emerging or growing challenge is obviously the impact of e-commerce on storefront retail. And we've written about this, and I think there's probably more of an impact on jobs than on storefronts, but we are seeing vacancies in a bunch of places. And as e-commerce continues to accelerate, it's a challenge. And we know how important storefront retail is for communities, whether it's in Midtown or in Jamaica. And so, are your agencies, are you thinking about rethinking retail, or what are you doing, or what do you think we ought to be moving towards?
Yeah, I mean, the last mile phenomenon was happening well before COVID, but COVID accelerated it, made, what might have taken 10 years happen in, 18 months. And that has had an impact on storefronts. And so I think, for landlords, they need to be rethinking, how they connect with the public that's passing their buildings, and, what can draw them in. And I did spend about 10 years at Industry City. If you walk through there, I think you have a sense of what is a sense of dynamic retail and culture that will interest people to come and explore it, see the making happening, also spend money. And part of the challenge we have in some of these commercial buildings where a lot of commercial mortgages are coming due is, they were financed with an expectation of super high rents from, the latest national drugstore. Super high rents. Some of those, financing deals need to be restructured and reimagined, and those landlords need to think through how to create a more dynamic.
Is there any role
plan
for city economic development and facilitating that?
There is, and we're encouraging that, and I think this Fifth Avenue process, has created, a forum for those conversations with both the landlords and the retailers at the base of the buildings and the business improvement districts that do a great job supporting them. The one other thing I'll say about last mile, which has an enormous impact on quality of life, is how you get those packages. And there's been a lot of news recently. We just put out a Blue Way RFEI to bring in best ideas around industrial maritime uses of all kinds and where they should be, but particularly last mile to facilitate micromobility distribution, where goods come into the city by barge, go straight onto an electric bike, and get delivered to buildings, substantially reducing traffic and emissions from trucks.
Got it. Well, I've been kind of rushing through things because I do want to get a question or two from the audience, but I'm going to ask one more question for both of you, and I'm going to throw a couple things in it, but they're things that we heard from the previous panel. One is, you know, I think that because of the changes we're seeing in office tenancy with remote work, and maybe because of some of the things we're seeing with retail no longer being as much of a draw into Manhattan, it seems to me that tourism is probably even more important to the city's economic future than it was before. You know, and that gets maybe more into that Glazer questions around kind of entertainment and, you know, kind of other things that are draws in the city. You know, so to what extent, you know, what can we be doing to kind of, you know, accelerate the tourism recovery? I know it's getting there and we're almost all the way back, but obviously it does seem even more important. So what can we do? And are there new amenities or things that we could be doing? And the City of Yes is certainly allowing some of those new entertainment uses that I think are restricted. But what else should we be doing to promote a tourism recovery? And separate but related is a couple people on the first panel talked about public art. You know, things like the gates. Things that can have such a global can provide global attention for the city, but also make New Yorkers feel really good about the city at a time we probably need that. Are there kind of thoughts about like doing more with public art here in New York? Anyway, those are two somewhat related questions, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
So one of the things that we have focused on as a state is really bringing back Broadway. We have a program that, tax credit program that supports really getting these productions back online because we know that Broadway really drives tremendous tourism. And so that's a real focus of something that we have decided to do.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I agree, and there are a number of initiatives we have to really drive those kinds of big entertainment experiences and conversations that are actively happening with productions that are based elsewhere but are considering coming to New York. And I can just say it's a good thing to be on the receiving end of that interest. It says that people still see New York as the place you've got to be to, you know, really generate the kinds of returns you might want. And part of that is, you know, tourism coming back so heavily. A couple of examples where we have facilities that can be used for this. One goes back to the North Shore, Staten Island, and you know, the sort of missed opportunity with the New York Wheel project there. I almost called it whale, but you know, we pulled the Band-Aid off of that when we came in. That site is now free and clear of the previous development group that couldn't execute. And we have an RFP back out that's going to go back out on the market later this month. It is ideal for this kind of big entertainment activation that's a draw. There are 20 million tourists that get on the ferry going back and forth just to sightsee, go by the Statue of Liberty, but they don't get off enough on the Staten Island side. So the original notion of the wheel was a good one, to pull people off of those boats, to spend dollars, and also create opportunities for Staten Islanders to have a great recreation and entertainment facility. So there's a 70,000 square foot building there ready to go. It's about $200 million of infrastructure, requires probably 10 million more to finish. It's got 800 car parking garage. It's teed up and ready to go.
Awesome. Well, it's amazing to hear all that you're doing. I love the work on Broadway. We know how hard it was hit and how important it is. I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. Anybody? Over there. please keep it brief because we only have a minute or two.
Absolutely. So just a quick question as to how would small businesses really embrace or support the hybrid work system? Like, just thinking about that, because we're looking at coverage, cross-training. So when you have small businesses, like, what does that look like for them to really make this happen?
I mean, I think, EDC has supported a lot of incubators and accelerators over the years. We continue with that strategy, and part of MCOR will, require building owners that benefit from this long-term tax break to put those kinds of uses in their buildings. We're also, as I mentioned before, really focused on, creating space for makers in the green economy at the Brooklyn Army Terminal. I think part of the answer to the question is flex space, where some of the time you can work from home, some of the time you can be there and be in an ecosystem of other small businesses that can benefit from, the ideas that you have, not just in your own company, but down the hallway.
Thank you. Other question? No? I'm going to ask one more then. I mean, we also heard this on the previous panel, and we'll end with this question, but obviously there's a lot that you want to do in economic development. There's a lot that we want to do in the city. We heard on the first discussion around the city of Yes and just how hard it is even to get something that seems so simple and logical and what should be a no-brainer to even get that through. But, there's obviously kind of a political process to a lot of things. And I think, there was a frustration on the first panel that, as much as this administration is about getting things done, that it can be real hard to get things done in this city, and that a lot of people feel that. And I guess, and I think one of our panelists even said that while there was a broad consensus on the panel that we absolutely need to fight as a city now to kind of keep people, to retain people, to attract companies, to retain companies, that it's not a given, that there isn't a feeling among every council member that we as a city need to fight for things right now. And I guess I wanted to ask you just in conclusion, what's one thing that you'd like your counterparts in the legislature, both at the statewide and the city, is there one thing, or whether it's one thing or one project that you'd like them to either know or do to support what you're trying to do on the economy?
So I can't think of one project, but what I will tell you is I spent a lot of time talking to electeds about how competitive it is. I think they don't have an appreciation that, when we are pitching to get businesses here, we are pitching against many other cities, some domestically, some internationally, and they have a choice of where they can go. And so to the extent that they really understood how difficult it is, and we need to make it much more attractive for companies to locate here, it would make our jobs easier and help us grow the economy much quicker.
I like that. Andrew?
Yeah, well said. And I think, mostly as complement to the governor's plan around transit-oriented development, particularly outside the 5 boroughs, there's a lot of news coverage about how we're lagging other states, California, New Jersey, with, building that kind of density. And we need to keep pushing that narrative to convince state legislators to act. I would say at the city council level, what I appreciate about this mayor is the level of engagement, the lack of fear at any point to engage in a controversial project. And I think we also see at the city council level, and it's played out in some recent rezonings, like Innovation Queens, where Councilmember Julie Wand got to the right place with some help from the speaker, with some help from the city council. It was a private rezoning, over 1,000 units of housing. Very difficult decision on her part, got to the right place. And it goes to, the speaker coming out early on in support of the rezoning that's now being studied for Jamaica. Same thing in Morris Park. So I think there is a growing recognition in the city council that, to create the kind of overall prosperity we all want, there needs to be more density, particularly transit-oriented, and obviously with the appropriate levels and balance of market rate versus affordable, which again goes back to the need for a 421A program.
All right, well, let's end there, but please join me in thanking this amazing, not only, and I want to just say, not only an amazing panel, but really a couple people who are making a real difference, and the jobs numbers is one area where, while New York still has some challenges, you all are really getting some results, so thank you for that, and thanks for being here.
Great.